3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, has a reputation. Ravers, glow sticks, UFOs, pants, not aliens. As you would expect from a drug users call ecstasy, the effects are anxiety, depression, paranoia. Wait a sec. I guess that isn't a reliable source. It makes people feel good. Ecstatically good. But there's more to it than that. It turns down fear and anxiety. It promotes bonding, empathy, trust. It breaks down social and emotional barriers. It compels you to accept yourself, to accept others, to accept ideas you might otherwise be resistant to. It can leave you feeling at peace, with the good and the bad. And the impact of this experience can endure long after the drug is gone. There are people who take it not to get high, but for personal growth. It's only natural to think we could use this drug as a medication, maybe in conjunction with therapy, for things like PTSD. There's no question it could work. In fact, there's been research on it with great results, and it's being reviewed this year for FDA approval. A decision is due by August 11th. August 11th? Oh, hey. Rejected? But the studies say it works. Is this because it'll eat into the profits of Big Pharma? Is this because it's a threat to the drug war industrial complex? Is the FDA full of anti-drug squares that don't know a miracle cure when they see one? Did they forget to turn on and tune in before they dropped out? The answer is, unfortunately, no. I mean, unfortunate in that there are good reasons for the rejection. Not that it would be fortunate if that other stuff were true. I'm Dr. Jen, PharmD, and I want to talk about the studies using MDMA-Assisted Therapy, MDMA-AT, to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and what went wrong with FDA approval. PTSD is a debilitating condition and can develop in response to trauma. It's a problem among veterans, but also victims of sexual assault, child abuse, even bad car accidents. For some people, it can be severe and disabling to the point of suicide. It's a life and death matter. Current treatments are trauma-focused therapies, sometimes in conjunction with medication, but those medications can take weeks to work. They have to be taken every day. There's been no new drug treatments approved for 25 years. Treatment doesn't help everyone. Lots of people still struggle. PTSD is a life-threatening condition, and we need better treatments. Trauma is difficult to talk about or even think about. It makes talk therapy tricky, but MDMA can make it feel okay for a while. It lets the patient discuss their trauma, and it makes them more receptive to seeing things in a different way. PTSD is characterized by hypervigilance, anxiety, emotional numbing, and withdrawal. MDMA can help calm people, while also helping them be present and emotionally connected. Can MDMA-assisted therapy help PTSD? That's what the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, has been trying to answer for over 2 decades. MAPS is a nonprofit organization based in the U.S. For a drug to be used as a medication in the U.S., it has to be FDA approved, and that's based on evidence from clinical trials. Approval means it's safe enough, the benefits outweigh the risks, and that it's effective for the condition it's approved for. Clinical trials are done in 3 phases, with phase 3 being the final one before approval. In 2017, Lykos Therapeutics, a company that MAPS created, worked with the FDA to get input on design for phase 3 trials. This is very common for applicants to do because who wants to go through all the trouble and expense of phase 3 trials if there's going to be a problem that comes up later. So Lykos and the FDA agreed on endpoints and other critical parts of the protocol. PTSD would be measured on a scale called the CAPS-5. the clinician-administered PTSD scale, and that's based on a clinical interview with the patient. To minimize bias, the therapists themselves didn't do these interviews, they were done by independent raters. A response was defined as a 10-point reduction. If they had a 10-point reduction but no longer met the criteria for PTSD, that would be a loss of diagnosis. The FDA let Lykos know that it did not need to do additional studies on drug abuse potential, but the FDA did say adverse events associated with potential abuse or overdose must be documented. The FDA didn't agree on every detail. Notably, the FDA was concerned about blinding. This was designed as a double-blind randomized control trial, and therapy with MDMA would be compared against therapy with an inert placebo. The FDA worried that it wouldn't be hard for a participant to know whether they'd gotten the MDMA or the inert placebo, and they suggested to Lykos that they should use like a low dose of MDMA or niacin or stimulant to make it a little less obvious. For Lykos in phase 2, they'd actually used low-dose MDMA as their control, but it caused anxiety with some people, and they were concerned that niacin or stimulants would worsen the PTSD. But Lykos did agree to survey the participants after the trial, see if they could guess what group they were in. We'll come back to that. Spoiler, the dose was 120 to 180 milligrams. It was in split doses, so that the peak of the effect could be extended without raising the dose, and the second dose could be withheld if there were a problem. Each participant had 3 90-minute prep sessions, then 3 sets of sessions. 1 8-hour dosing session with 3 90-minute integration sessions, spaced 1 week apart. Sessions each had 2 therapists, at least 1 licensed. Sessions were recorded on video. There were adherence raters to watch and make sure the therapists followed protocol. As a side note, and this is irrelevant to approval, this is pretty resource intensive. A standard course of therapy for PTSD might be like 12 60-minute sessions, 12 hours total therapist time, and this is 42 hours per therapist, 84 hours of therapist time. This is not the most scalable intervention. Again, it's not relevant to approval, it's just worth noting. There was also a long-term follow-up study to see if any improvement lasted over time. So with everything squared away, in August of 2017, the FDA gave this breakthrough therapy designation. Breakthrough therapy is for drugs that treat a serious condition when early evidence shows it may be a substantial improvement over current treatments. Lykos did 2 phase 3 trials. The trials were completed and published in 2021 and 2023. They were a success. A big success. In the first trial, participants in the MDMA group had a 24.5-point reduction in the CAPS-5 score compared to 12.6 in the placebo. 88% in the MDMA group had a response, and 67% had a loss of diagnosis, compared to 62% and 32% in the placebo group. In the second trial, the MDMA group had a 23.7-point reduction compared to 14.8 reduction in the placebo. 87% had a response, 71% had a loss of diagnosis, compared to 69% and 48% respectively. The long-term follow-up study found the effect to be durable. In December of 2023, Lykos submitted their new drug application to the FDA. That's the final application for drug approval. And in February this year, 2024, the FDA accepted the application, and they granted priority review, so a decision would be made within 6 months, August 11th. But there were some bad signs. The Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER, looked at the studies. They had a meeting on May 30th and voted that the evidence was insufficient for MDMA-AT. Then on June 4th, an FDA advisory committee recommended against approving MDMA-AT. Specifically, they voted 9-2 that based on the current evidence it was not effective, and 10-1 that the benefits do not outweigh the risks. This was not the final decision, it's a recommendation, but what gives? I mean, given the things some government agencies say about MDMA, One might imagine the whole meeting went like this.
I'm also super concerned about the abuse liability. I mean, I think there will be left and right diversion. Illicit MDA is going to soar, because it's going to be all over the map.
To be honest, I kind of thought that. This all happens over a backdrop of a war on drugs. I've been generally following MAPS over the years. I knew about this research, and I figured I'd wait and see what it came up with, which was that it worked. So I wasn't particularly critical at first. I'm biased. The first time I went to college, I was an art major. But I wasn't a music major. I mean, there could be some flaws in the study. That effect size, though. And PTSD sucks. We need new treatments. But the committee meeting was 9 hours and 44 minutes. There must be a little bit more to the discussion. So let's take a look. What is an FDA advisory committee? Well, it's not the FDA. It's an independent panel of outside experts nominated for the role. And it includes a consumer representative and a patient representative. Ahead of the meeting, they accept written public comments. During the meeting, they have an open public hearing. That's usually an hour. But there was a citizen's petition to extend it, so this one was an hour and 45 minutes. Open public meeting is open. Anyone who had an interest could comment. There were veterans, journalists, psychedelic ethicists, the American Psychiatric Association, Disabled American Veterans, other organizations weighed in, as did some participants. As you would expect, there were a lot of public comments that were in support of approval, both from organizations and individuals.
And I cannot put into words how much this drug-assisted therapy helped me when I got into it. The parts of me that I thought were permanently damaged, the way I saw the world and I responded to stimuluses, it changed. Innocuous sounds and actions that you guys would not notice, that used to fill me with rage, anger, fear, anxiety, and shame, they now go by so unnoticed that I feel normal.
Many trauma survivors fight reality and acceptance because they had no control over their experience. I learned that I was living in survival mode. And once I was able to process my grief and trauma, I felt self-empathy and self-love for the first time in decades.
MDMA became a catalyst, opening a pathway for me to explore a new outlook. Through this experience, I discovered the power of forgiveness, love, and self-appreciation, transforming not just my relationship with others, but also with myself. This transformation has made me a more effective partner, parent, and friend. What's most significant to me is the presence that it has granted me, enhancing my enjoyment of motherhood. I am deeply thankful to MDMA-Assisted Therapy for reshaping and enriching my bond with my child.
Within the very first hour of the MDMA session, I felt an intense sense of repair, a spontaneous rewiring of my mind to body. The effects were immediate. The emotional flooding vanished. What used to feel like a tsunami of overwhelming panic was now merely a puddle at my feet. A changed perspective is everything. If MDMA is a reset button, my skilled therapists were right there to ground my experience. Our therapeutic alliance fully unlocked this window of opportunity to process my traumas.
Some comments had less glowing things to say. We'll come back to that in a minute. As I mentioned earlier, the trial was blinded. Right? Survey says 94% of the MDMA group correctly guessed which group they were in. 75% of the placebo group guessed. They didn't survey the therapists, but I'm guessing they could figure it out too. It was functionally unblinded. I'm not blaming Lykos. I'm not saying it's easy or even possible to blind a study like this, but it does mean there could be expectancy bias, both on the part of the participants and the therapists. Their expectations can change how they feel and what they do. This wasn't the only issue, though. There was a selection bias. 40% of the participants had used MDMA before. Participants who'd had experience were likely to only be ones who had good experiences, because if they'd had bad experiences, they wouldn't have joined. So it's a bit of a problem. The people involved in the trial weren't objective going into it. The results are based on clinical interviews, not lab values, so that kind of bias can influence the results. But what about the long-term follow-up, showing that participants who were improved were still improved? So there was only a single follow-up interview, and it was at a variable time after the last dose, 6 months to 2 years. PTSD symptoms can fluctuate, so how do you know that you didn't just catch them at a good time? More importantly, participants had other interventions in between the end of the trial and the follow-up, like therapy, but also sometimes other drugs like ketamine or psychedelics, or even illicit MDMA. So if they're doing well in the long term, how do you know it was because of the trial treatment and not some later treatment? And only about 75% of the participants were in the follow-up. So there's a high risk of bias here. The studies did have a large effect size, and that's the reason 2 committee members voted yes for effective, but it's a pretty hefty set of confounders. In cases like this, sometimes studies provide a statistical model to estimate how much bias might have contributed, but these didn't. People have used MDMA illicitly for decades, so we know it's safe, than its cousin meth, but it's not harmless. MDMA has stimulant effects. During dosing, it raised heart rate and blood pressure significantly. Pretty much any drug that raises your blood pressure significantly, it can put stress on the heart. There have been documented cases with illicit use of heart attack, aortic dissection, CNS hemorrhage, so we know it's possible. In phase 3, there were no serious cardiac events. In phase 2, there was 1 case of arrhythmia. They held the second dose, took them to the hospital, they were fine. The trouble is there's not enough data to guess how often this might happen. They did do EKGs at baseline, but they didn't have any post-dose EKGs, and that would have been really helpful. And it doesn't give us a lot to go on. Suicidal behaviors were a concern, but the studies were good on that part.
Patients in both groups experienced suicidal symptoms, which are expected in this patient population. The frequency of symptoms was comparable between the 2 groups. Of note, there were no suicidal behaviors or attempts reported in the MDMA group.
As I said earlier, the FDA did want adverse events associated with potential abuse or overdose. They wanted not just negative adverse effects, but positive or neutral effects from MDMA, like euphoria, elevated mood. And that's because those type of effects can lead people to use it outside the medical setting and in higher doses. But there was an apparent misunderstanding. Lykos didn't interpret effects like that as adverse, so they didn't record effects that were positive, neutral, or favorable. It's not just about non-medical use. This information is useful for answering questions like, what effects are expected during therapy? How long is the patient impaired? When is it safe for the patient to go home? So Lykos is now documenting this stuff in its current studies. Yeah, so there's kind of limited safety data in general. These trials were small in comparison to most drugs. There's less than 500 people in the safety database, but there's an estimated 13 million Americans who have PTSD. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it does mean we'd have to rely on post-marketing safety surveillance to figure out what level of risk there is. For a drug like this, the FDA would require a REMS, a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. A REMS can include things like that can only be dispensed in certain healthcare settings, that a patient has to be enrolled in a registry, that lab results are required for safe use, that the patient is medically supervised. There were concerns, in particular brought up in public comments, not about MDMA itself, but the therapy.
Hello, my name is Bo Witka. I just want to start off by saying it was very hard for me to join you today, and it was equally challenging for me to write the statement that I'm reading, since I currently find myself in the midst of what I openly describe as the most terrifying time of my life. The frightening state I am in and I've learned to cope with to the best of my ability began immediately following a single guided MDMA-assisted therapy session on February 19th, 2023. In spite of my difficulties and discomfort presenting to you, I want to be as candid as possible about my experience, since I'm living proof of the dangers of the therapy component of MDMA-assisted therapy, and I feel like I have a duty to educate and warn others about something I was completely ignorant of prior to my treatment last year. that MDMA can cause lasting harm to a client when administered under the guidance of an inept and/or inexperienced therapist. This experience has completely derailed my life. I've been able to work for the last 15 months, and I've had to live with a family member while I attempt to recover on my own. Just a few of the symptoms I've experienced on a daily basis with often abrupt, inconsistent, and unpredictable fluctuations include extreme exhaustion, brain fog, severe cognitive impairment, unrefreshing sleep, headaches, eye issues, and a long list that's too extensive to share with you today. I'm 100% pro MDMA and would like to see the drug legalized for therapeutic use. However, I cannot support MDMA-assisted therapy being allowed to go mainstream until more training and research is conducted to better understand how to avoid outcomes like mine, and more importantly, how to support people who experience extended difficulties. There is zero support for people like me and absolutely no safety net in place.
This is a thorny problem because the FDA does not regulate therapy. They can require labeling saying a drug is intended to be used with therapy, but even in their REMS, they're limited to how specific they can be. They can say things like, at least 2 healthcare providers must be on site to monitor psychological status for at least 8 hours, but it's not too particular. But let's talk a bit about the therapy because it will be relevant. There are validated evidence-based therapies for PTSD, like cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy. The MAPS manual and taught in their training programs is not one of them. MAPS has a novel therapeutic approach. This is a bit of a problem because we have a new intervention, MDMA, and we're studying it with a second new intervention, the MAPS therapy. That leaves us with no comparison to the standard of care. There is also no comparison to MDMA by itself. That would have its own risks and problems, but it could have been informative, especially since the FDA does not regulate therapy. In the MAPS therapy manual, it says, "It is essential to encourage the participant to trust their inner healing intelligence, which is a person's innate capacity to heal the wounds of trauma. It is important to highlight the fact that the participant is the source of their own healing. The MDMA and the therapists are likely to facilitate access to a deep healing process, but they are not the source of this healing process. Therapists should trust that any fear, memories, etc. that keep coming up are doing so to be healed, to be more fully understood, and that the participant's psyche/inner healer knows when the best time is for this to occur." There is a lot of talk of the inner healing intelligence, but this originated as part of a spiritual philosophy, first taught by Stan Grof. It proposes that healing is connected to the collective unconscious, and that the inner healer will only show you what you're ready for. This is not an approach that's been empirically validated. The manual gives some analogies. Seeds want to become a plant. It is the natural way. They want to become plants, all right. Especially those invasive honeysuckles. They have a voracious lust to become a plant. An insatiable hunger that robs native flora of nutrients and light. They poison the roots and seeds around them with allelopathic chemicals to stamp out all potential competitors. Sorry, I'm ruining a good naturalistic fallacy. If someone goes to the emergency room with a laceration, a doctor can remove obstacles to healing, remove foreign bodies, infection, etc., and help create favorable conditions for healing, sew the edges of the wound together. But the doctor does not direct or cause the healing that ensues. It makes intuitive sense. But is that analogy valid? Some people have wounds that don't heal, for instance, diabetics. Isn't PTSD more like a wound that doesn't heal, years after the proverbial foreign bodies and infections are removed? Isn't that the whole problem? But never mind that, there's another problem. Standard therapeutic approaches aren't just about healing, they're about learning. Learning how to process events and move forward in life. Why don't we talk about the inner piano playing intelligence? The piano teacher, they're just there to remove barriers to playing well. Bad fingering, not lifting your foot off the pedal. But the teacher doesn't cause your playing, you're the one doing the playing. You could look at it that way, but would it be helpful? What happens if you're not making progress? Piano playing happens naturally. It's the natural way. If you haven't been getting better with our lessons, something's wrong with you. Isn't that something that can happen? What if you have the MDMA, you have the therapy, but it doesn't work? If it's this inner healing intelligence, where do you go from there?
All right. As Jason mentioned, I'll be speaking on behalf of Sarah McNamee. Like others I've spoken to, I tried telling my MAPS therapist about my worsening state, but I couldn't seem to get through to them. Two of us at different sites were told by our therapist that they, quote, predicted we would be feeling better in 6 months' time.
Another participant, Mel, shared this on a podcast.
I was just a mess. Suicide became a moment-to-moment option again. And now it was coupled with the fact that I had been given a miracle cure and wasted it.
If you don't heal, is it your fault? But there's another thing in that manual that has proven more problematic. In the manual, it states, therapeutic techniques should be available to address somatic manifestations of trauma that arise. These may include one or more approaches, such as nurturing touch, focused body work, breathing techniques, or other approaches to somatosensory processing. Touch, nurturing or not, is a dicey issue in therapy. From the get-go, there's a power imbalance between therapist and patient. That all by itself can make consent issues tricky. Certainly, the manual emphasizes in several places only doing what the participant wants, that there's no agenda, it's totally up to them, and so forth. But does that really solve the problem? I mean, even if a participant initially says no, they could be encouraged to give it a try, right? If a therapist says, touch is an important part of therapy, they're the experts, right? On top of that, of course, MDMA can make someone really vulnerable. Imagine someone who's drunk. Their inhibitions are lower, they're more likely to say or do things they normally wouldn't, they might not remember everything. The situation with MDMA is similar. People on MDMA are more coordinated and alert than alcohol, but also much more trusting. The idea that consent is possible at all in this situation is questionable. In the manual it says, another kind of touch that can be therapeutic is focused body work, usually in the form of giving resistance for the participant to push against. This approach is aimed at intensifying and thereby facilitating release of blocks, tensions, or pains in the body that arise during therapy. It should be emphasized that it's entirely the participant's choice and they are in control regarding touch. They should be asked to use the word stop or some comparable alternative word if it is preferred by the participant, if there is ever any touch that the participant does not want. So there exists a situation in which you'd want or need some sort of safe word, in which the word stop wouldn't be good enough. Is the participant going to remember a safe word when they're in the thick of an MDMA session? Sounds like an invitation for boundary violations and assault. This happened with a Phase 2 participant named Megan.
Every morning I wake up and I wish I hadn't. My first thoughts are always about him. I don't like the word rapist, but therapist is not appropriate. Although really they're one and the same. After all, with nothing but a sharp intake of breath, therapist becomes the rapist. And this is where I pause every single time I try to sift through this mess. I pause, reminding myself that it's not his weight, rather the weight of the world crushing my chest. I want to scream. And I can't, because any hint of anger on my part will be pathologized by the trial sponsor.
MAPS issued a statement on what happened. They said there was no prior indication that the therapist would violate policy, and they will not be working with either therapist in the future. So MAPS' position seems to be that it was a couple bad apples. During the open public hearing.
Hello, my name is Sarah Grosh. I am a proxy reading a statement for Megan Puissant. What I experienced wasn't just two bad therapists. It was a predictable outcome of preventable harms and failures of Lykos. Vulnerable patients have no recourse when harms occur.
According to the MAPS statement, though the review is ongoing, MAPS has provisionally determined that Jensen and Dreyer substantially deviated from the MDMA-Assisted Therapy treatment manual on several occasions during the treatment period. Does that really solve the problem?
There is no question on whether what happened to me will happen again to someone else. It is only a matter of time. That doesn't negate the lived experience of those who say they may have benefited from this trial. It simply means they dodged a bullet.
In the week since I submitted my comment, I received 3 confirmations of separate predictions for my analysis. One came from a new phase 3 participant. I'm sharing her words here with permission. She wrote me, quote, "Since the study, I have woken from flashback nightmares, kicking and yelling for my original perpetrator to get off me, mixed with the memory of my MAPS therapist standing over me with a pillow and trying to kick her off me, as she had me do in the tape-recorded session. It's been overwhelming, confusing, and exhausting. But worse has been waking up in thick, sludgy shame, knowing I failed the study and the rare opportunity I was given to heal, as all the success stories are blaring in the news," end quote.
The public has no idea what the world of psychedelic therapy condones as normal behavior. These behaviors have been justified under the umbrella of exposure therapies, somatic therapies, and more, but the psychotherapy experts that we have consulted tell us that this couldn't be further from what these evidence-based practices are supposed to look like.
The severe PTSD that brought me into this clinical trial went unaddressed and unresolved. All they did was pour a concrete foundation of new traumas over top.
To be clear, she was in the success group. The Power Trip podcast series also interviewed 2 participants from Phase 3, Mel and Leah. They didn't report assault, but they ran into some other issues.
As I was coming down off the medicine, there was just this deep knowledge that something had been left wide open and completely unresolved, and hell was inside of me and was only halfway out, and it got stuck. I felt like I got stuck.
You know, I've equated it to someone did open heart surgery, and they tore open my chest and they repaired the little damage in the heart there, but then everyone just walked away from the table and my chest was still wide open.
Here's the confounding thing. A few weeks after their final integration sessions, both Leah and Mel were asked to take the CAPS test again. And when they took this test, their answers indicated that their PTSD diagnoses were gone.
The ICER report says, "We heard from multiple people that the CAPS-5 measures of improvement failed to capture participants' overall response to MDMA-AT. We repeatedly heard about participants experiencing improvement or resolution in the single trauma identified for the CAPS-5 measurements, while new issues became overwhelming following MDMA-AT. But, as with many issues we encountered, we are unable to assess the frequency of these events. If we don't know how often this happened, how do we know if the MDMA was effective or not? And there's another problem. It seems the participants didn't want to report a failure."
I felt like I just needed to report how I was getting better, how things were improving. I'm the one who wants nothing more than to be better. I'm the one who doesn't want to disappoint my therapist. I'm the one who doesn't want to screw everything up for every other person who wants to try this medicine.
That is laying quite the responsibility on the patient.
How would you define disappointing them?
By not being better, that all their hard work was for nothing.
Is it fair to say that you wanted to believe that it was working?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to believe that it was working.
At the end of the trial, when Mel had to answer the questions on that test called the CAPS, she says her answers were driven more by that belief than by what she was actually feeling.
The ICER report said, "We heard repeatedly about pressures to have the results of the MAP trials be favorable. There apparently was a sense that such therapies are beneficial and needed, and that negative results could hinder progress. So, yeah, this really calls into question the results."
While I was in the study, there were many things that my trial therapist did. Things I accepted because I believed they were experts, because I wanted to heal, because they said this was a paradigm-shifting treatment, and because of the MDMA they gave me. Things I would never condone as a therapist or as a researcher. The list is too long to fully cover in this format, but it includes things like encouraging me to view my worsening symptoms as evidence of healing and, quote, spiritual awakening, seeding mistrust in mainstream psychiatry, introducing concepts like past life traumas, encouraging and, at one time, pressuring me to cuddle with them, repeatedly telling me I was, quote, helping make history and that I was, quote, part of a movement, viewing my boundaries as psychological resistance, and letting me know how my responses and behaviors during and after the trial could jeopardize legalization.
In her written comment to the FDA Advisory Committee, she said this: "Over a very intense 3-month period, while I was being given suggestibility-enhancing drugs, my therapist systematically engaged with me in ways that influenced me to become a representative of the movement to legalize MDMA therapy, and shaped my behavior as a research participant, and therefore shaped the data I provided through self-reports. I quickly adopted their beliefs and views about methods I would have previously balked at, for example, cuddling with clients, and I enrolled in a psychedelic therapy training before I was even discharged from the trial. I even changed my voting behavior in a federal election that took place while I was enrolled in the trial. I voted for a party whose platform I explicitly disagree with, but who my therapists verbalized explicit support for. This adds another layer. MDMA has a powerful effect. These very sudden changes in my beliefs, values, and behaviors, even some aspects of my personality, are mystifying to me, because these kinds of changes and the direction those changes went in are wildly out of character for me. They are even more mystifying because at the same time that I was turning into a firm advocate of MDMA therapy, I was also relentlessly suicidal and was clinically decompensating in a, frankly, spectacular way. It doesn't seem like this drug, in this setting, is working the way we thought it would. I do not believe my trial therapists meant to influence me this way, and I certainly don't think they meant to harm me. That's what makes this all so worrisome. The drugs induced a blind trust and loyalty towards my therapists that I still struggle to understand, and I took on their skewed interpretations and beliefs with a speed and depth that astounds me, and which has taken years to understand and undo. The things MDMA enhances, bonding, empathy, trust, are things we value, are things we assume are good. But they can be bad. There's a reason we don't just trust everyone. There's more.
The sponsor lied to the committee about adverse events and safety monitoring.
Lied to the committee? What's that about?
I have reported on footage depicting a MAPS trial subject informing multiple MAPS researchers that they engaged in suicidal behavior during their clinical trial after their first MDMA treatment session. However, the relevant trial publication claims that no suicidal behavior occurred, quote, during the treatment period after dosing. I can provide this footage to the FDA upon request.
Of note, there were no suicidal behaviors or attempts reported in the MDMA group.
Oh. Suicidal behavior in a suicidal group of patients doesn't necessarily mean the benefits don't outweigh the risks. But if Lykos lied, it's one more risk we don't have good data about.
Instead of properly reporting and investigating adverse events and SAEs, multiple reports and documents show MAPS and Lykos staff doing quote-unquote mental gymnastics to dismiss those events as, quote, not drug-related. This is injurious to the participants and deprives the medical community of information it needs to improve and assess safety.
In the committee, the patient representative acknowledged those who had been helped by MDMA, but didn't think these allegations should be glossed over.
I want everyone who has had success with MDMA to know that I have heard you, but also I can't in good conscience support something where these many harms are being reported and just say, oh, someone somewhere is investigating it and I'm sure it will be taken care of. I think patterns of, institutional violence that we've seen, things that don't get addressed, we have We learn this over and over and over, and it doesn't often change. And so I think it's important that that has to be called out.
So is approving MDMA and slapping a REMS on the way to go? Critics of the critics will say allegations about therapy or therapy abuse is not really relevant to approval. The FDA isn't here to approve protocols for therapy. The FDA does not regulate therapy. Once it's approved, in fact, I'm pretty sure non-MAPS providers can do their own therapy as long as they follow requirements like giving 8 hours of psychological support. And legally reclassifying MDMA would make research easier. But is it safe and effective? The way the therapy component was handled clearly influenced the results. Maybe a little, maybe a lot, we don't know to what extent. This on top of functional unblinding, the lack of comparison to a standard, and outstanding cardiac safety questions, and then knowing that serious adverse events may have been omitted, it leaves us with more questions than answers. Does MDMA-assisted psychotherapy work for PTSD? The truth is, we don't know. Some people have testified that it turned their life around, but some people have testified that it turned their life upside down. And there are too many confounders to know how many people are in each group. We need better research than what Lykos has submitted. I'm also in favor of new legal frameworks to make this research easier. Knowing the pharmacology of MDMA, the effects, I definitely have hope that it can work, but hope is not a strategy.
Ultimately, if MDMA therapy is approved, as current protocols stand, we're looking at potentially increasing the burden of illness for countless people with PTSD and making a suffocating mental illness even more difficult to live with and treat, as the MAPS trials have done for a portion of their participants. Trauma survivors deserve better.
On August 9th, the FDA sent a complete response letter to Lykos, rejecting the application in its current form. They requested an additional Phase 3 study. Lykos will appeal the decision, just in case, but it probably won't change anything. Regardless, they'll meet with the FDA to discuss these issues and work on them. This is not the end, and it's important to get this right. One last thought. When I watched the open public hearing, something that surprised me was the number of people who really do want MDMA to be part of a medically approved treatment, but who were critical.
My name is Sife Tayo Harvey. I'm the Executive Director of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. There's a tendency in the psychedelic community to shy away from critiques or confrontations. I consider a lot of the speakers colleagues, and one common theme between us is that we entered the psychedelic field as enthusiasts for the movement. Yet, we know when we love something, you must critique it. I've also witnessed the field and MAPS dismiss valid concerns from other critics and a refusal to engage those concerns. After seeing the evidence of abuses, cross boundaries, and buried discrepancies, I've concluded that there needs to be more rigorous research on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy before it's brought to the public. I hope that after this hearing, the field starts to hold itself to a higher standard.
That's all I have for you today. I hope you liked this video. If you did, consider liking, subscribing, and keep an eye out for future videos.